Right, well, welcome to an Evolve Our Prison Farms Community Forum. Today, the theme of this discussion is going to be exploring the topic of prison farms through abolitionist perspectives, featuring a very special guest, Elle Jones, and I will be introducing her. My name is Calvin Neufeld. I'm the founder of Evolve Our Prison Farms. We have been active since 2016. We emerged out of the history of Save Our Prison Farms activism with a vision for prison farms that would be healing and restorative for prisoners, animals, and earth. Since that time, while we continue to hold up the vision of what's possible, our campaign now stands in opposition to the new prison farm model that is being established as a pilot project beginning in 2020 in Kingston, Ontario, which will be harmful to prisoners, harmful to animals, and harmful to the environment. As most of you would know by now, despite all available possibilities for the prison farms, such as feeding prisoners or feeding food banks and food insecure communities, the Correctional Service of Canada is establishing unprecedented for-profit prison labor for the private sector through industrial agriculture in a multi-million-dollar operation that will use prison labor to factory farm thousands of goats, reportedly to sell raw milk to a Chinese transnational infant formula corporation for export to China. We have started this community forum series to allow Canadians to have a voice in this issue, which our government has not allowed. They did consultations in early 2016 when everyone thought the old program was coming back, that is, prison farms feeding prisoners. There has been no public consultation on this new model that involves the violation, the trampling, the bulldozing of human, animal, and climate justice. So we are creating that platform for discussion and exploration of different voices and perspectives, to grow and learn from one another, and to build a network of solidarity in the pursuit of justice for all. Today, our special guest is poet and prisoner justice advocate Elle Jones, a national champion spoken word artist, an award-winning human rights activist, and co-founder of Black Power Hour, a radio show developed collectively with prisoners. The theme of our community forum today, as I said, is to explore this topic of prison farms through an abolitionist lens. We will have an opportunity to listen to Elle speak, and then we will open the floor to questions and discussion along this theme. You can type questions in the chat section for one of our moderators to read, or type an X if you would like a chance to speak personally, and you will be given that opportunity in order of priority. But first, we will open with a land acknowledgement by our advocacy coordinator, Darren Chang.
Cool, thanks Calvin for that introduction. So before we start the conversations, just want to acknowledge that while we're all gathered online from many different places, most of us live and work on stolen and occupied Indigenous lands. So as we discuss issues related to prisons and agriculture, we must keep in mind that both prisons and agricultural industries are colonial projects that have been directly complicit in the land theft, assimilation, and genocide committed against Indigenous peoples, particularly in settler colonial contexts. According to a report by the Yellowhead Institute, Black people account for 10% of the federal prison population while making up only 3% of the general population in so-called Canada. And Indigenous people account for 30% of the federal prison population, despite representing 5% of the overall population. And this is a direct result of the racist targeting of Black and Indigenous communities for policing and criminalization. Meanwhile, numerous studies have shown that animal agriculture and aquaculture, similar to other resource extraction industries like oil, gas, and mining, are major contributors to the destruction of land, water, and air, ultimately leading to more climate catastrophes while mass killing our non-human kin and relatives. It is with these injustices in our minds that we proceed with our community forum to come together, to learn from each other, and discuss ways toward just and liberated futures. And with that acknowledgement, I'll pass it over to our guest speaker, Al Jones, to start us off with the conversations.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everybody. I'm actually in Antigonish right now in a basement trying to use a very spotty Wi-Fi. So if I somehow get kicked out of the Zoom, I will come back, be patient, edit it later for the live. But thank you so much. I'm also in Mi'kmaq, the historic territory of the Mi'kmaq, which is unceded and was never surrendered, governed by the Peace and Friendship Treaties of 1752, signed at a time when the British Crown were also, of course, enslaving African people all around the world. So we also need to contemplate that. I'm going to try and keep my remarks relatively short so that we can engage in some discussion and back and forth. By the way, for those who don't know, I'm actually kind of an erstwhile Queen's student right now. So I'm supposed to be taking my PhD at Queen's, but of course with COVID, I'm not traveling, but it's really nice to somewhat virtually be part of this Kingston community where I transferred to do my PhD. So I'm excited to, be doing something with people in Kingston. So thank you so much for inviting me. What I wanted to think through tonight is obviously from an abolitionist perspective, what does that mean? With the obvious point that I'm going to say up front is ultimately we don't want people on prison farms, we want people free on the land. And we always keep that in mind. But of course, as we're trying to reach that point, we as abolitionists understand that we simply cannot draw a line and say, well, if it's not out of a prison, I don't want to do it because I believe in abolition. We of course have to find ways as we work to abolish the prison. We still know that there are people living in those prisons every day, and it is also our duty and responsibility to do what we can to try and improve those lives, not for the goal of prison reform, but for the goal of people's existence. So whatever that is, and that sometimes means things like, paying for people's phones that supports a prison industrial complex, paying for people's canteen that supports a prison industrial complex. We make all kinds of human connections that go against what we absolutely believe as abolitionists, but we understand as human beings, we need to do what we can do to improve that life. So obviously working towards the goal of prison farms helps integrate people with community, helps move people outside, helps change some of these ideas around even how we think of a prisoner's body existing. And for that reason, we understand as abolitionists, we can see that within the goal. Without thinking of it as just simply a goal of prison reform instead. So I wanted to just say that up front. What I always say is that if you're an abolitionist, you should be an environmentalist and vice versa. So for people who are environmentalists, whatever that means in this day, against climate change, for the environment, then you should be an abolitionist. Prisons themselves are environmental disasters. But beyond that, we think of, for example, how so many prisons are located in areas where the traditional industries have been destroyed. For example, in Nova Scotia, Spring Hill used to be a mining town, very famous for a mining collapse in the late 50s. It's now being downgraded to like a village, or I don't know how those things work. It used to be a village, now it's a town, or the other way around. And of course, the main industry there is now the prison. Renouse, which is where the maximum security of this region is outside of Miramichi, New Brunswick, another area that, traditionally lumber, fishing, these kind of industries that have gone, and what we're seeing them replaced with is prisons. And in fact, some of the guys that I talked to have had conversations, for example, with workers in the kitchens from like Miramichi, from the surrounding community, who said, well, we thought when the prison came up, like we would get jobs. But now that we're hearing from you guys about the conditions, we're rethinking this kind of investment in prison. So we understand that a lot of this investment for small towns in prison is seen as this way of like, we'll get labor because the traditional ways we used to labor, the land we used to live on, we used to fish, we used to farm, we used to do these different things, we can't do them. And we thought the prison was going to come in. So there's a real connection that way. There's also a connection even in terms of things like environmental racism. We can think of the community of Africville in Halifax, that when they were destroying Africville was multiple acts of environmental racism, from running train tracks through the place to putting a dump into hospitals for infectious disease. And of course, that community becomes highly incarcerated with the destruction of Africville as well. So there's a connection between destroying environment and criminalizing the people. So at every point that we turn to, and I don't want to make this like a 2-hour discourse, so in summary, we can see that if we're going to care about the environment and the histories of environmental destruction, they intersect with race, and they intersect with the prison industrial complex in the ways that it's also part of colonization. So if we're environmentalists, we have to think about the prison. I'm really happy that we're talking about prison farms tonight, because I think another really important point is this idea, and sorry to use like, I hope this isn't too academic language, but the growth of carcerality, the way the prison moves from the prison into the rest of the world. In Calvin's intro, we got a really good example of that. Kim Pate has also talked about this, for example, when the Healing Lodge was first begun for women. And when she first made a visit, she was like, you literally couldn't tell who was a guard and who was a woman unless I had met people in other places. Because there was no uniforms. They were, you know, using each other's names. But then she came back in 3 months and it had already turned to uniforms and like back to being wardens. So there was a very, very quick switch that the Healing Lodge, it was supposed to not be a prison. It was supposed to be inside the community. It was supposed to be completely connected, and immediately became a prison again, which similarly happened to so many of the women's prisons, that if we remember the Creating Choices report in 1991, was not supposed to have walls and bars, and they weren't supposed to be barbed wire, right? Everything was supposed to be no fences. And the communities who competed to get these prisons, like again, regional prison for Atlantic Canada's in Truro, people competed across Atlantic Canada to get this prison, for the contracts, for the building, for the guard jobs. And then once the prison was built, oh, we need the walls back up. So we always install a prison. And what's really interesting with the issue of prison farms, as Calvin has explained it, even in that short introduction, is we see this carcerality moving to the land and to animals. So when we're talking about the animals won't be allowed outside, they won't be able to graze, it's putting the prison into animals on a prison farm. So there's a literal logic of captivity that is now being put into nature, which mirrors the logic of, we can't let people go outside, we can't give people ETAs to go out, we don't want people with community. All these ideas of security and safety and barbed wire and walls are also being projected onto animals. There's a really good book that I'm like the only reader of, but it's one of my favorite books. I don't know if anyone's read Fear of an Animal Planet. By Jason Hribal, last name, one taker, Hribal. And the premise of the book is telling history from an animal's point of view, but specifically the idea that animals understand freedom. So he basically looks at animal escapes and like animal attacks through the lens of animals seeking freedom. So he talks about like elephants that, you know, will wait and let the children be taken off their backs and then go stomp out the trainer who's abused them. You know, chimpanzees that in nature are solitary but learn to cooperate in a zoo in order to help each other escape. And so he tells all these stories as escape. And his work's really interesting because of this premise, right? That he really connects the idea of freedom and liberation through our understanding of animals. In other places, he also argues that I think is really important when we think about the racial history of the prison. He talks, for example, about how the history of animals and the history of labor are together. So we literally talk about working like a dog, working like a mule. And when you look at the growth of labor rights movements, they were often connected to people also understanding the kind of ideology that went to abusing animals, to working animals to death. And there was a recognition on behalf of people working in labor to also see how that connection was through animals. If we think of the book Black Beauty, the horsey book, I mean, it's quite literally a black horse. That's not like even not obvious. It was a book about slavery, right? It was a book about abolition written through you know, the character of a horse. I'm not saying it's the world's best like discourse on Black people, but we know that similarly there was a connection between slavery and the treatment and abuse of animals. And that in fact, a lot of the early animal rights movements were speaking about animals in ways that they could not speak about Africans. And there was a kind of displacement of like the animals are being treated like Africans in ways that you wouldn't speak about slavery. But again, a recognition, the same ideology that went into the punishment and abuse and beating of Black people was also projected onto the bodies of animals as well. And so what does this go back to? Of course, a capitalist colonial system that sees the land as there to be abused. Vandana Shiva, of course, has done really amazing work on connecting the abuse of the land and war, and talks about making war on the earth and all the ways that our violence is taken out quite literally on the land. You know, that we use these phrases like Roundup to talk about immigrants and then use it as a pesticide. You know, that we talk about machete, Pentagon as pesticides and see ourselves as engaged in this war on earth. And she's made those connections really well. And then we have these connections with how we treat animals. And of course, things like factory farms and these abuses that we cannot separate from the way that we then think that human beings should be herded into cages, that human beings should be put in solitary, that human beings should not be given hard time, that human beings should live without windows, and we should design prisons that don't even have natural light. And then this all takes place on land that, as Darren said really well, is like stolen land, and that is always being appropriated and stolen for resources. So those connections are really important for us to understand why abolition goes through everything we do. I know in these times, I think less and less people think abolition is some weirdo thing. You know, up until May, it was like, you know, this weirdo thing that only, you know, a few people believed in. And now we're at a time where, you know, CBC is having discussions on abolition. But often we're having a discussion more through things like defunding, right? So it's still capitalist, it's still about money, and less perhaps about abolition as the idea of changing our relationship to land, to capitalism, to each other, to punishment. And that of course includes things like, if we're going to like kidnap thousands of goats and exploit them for milk to then send off, you know, in the same way that we send oil through pipelines, you know, these connections are there, and it's going to be done under the guise of this prison system. I think we can make that connection without seeming like we're weird. I think that's maybe it for my opening remarks. I think I've laid out where I am on this. But yeah, I think that as we think about abolition, those of us who understand it, we always know it's a daily goal, not like the prison isn't going to fall tomorrow. As Rachel Zellas always says, we ain't ready. You know, if they open the prisons tomorrow, we wouldn't know what to do because we haven't learned how to solve conflict, and we haven't learned how to be accountable with each other, and we haven't learned how to, you know, deal with harm, and we haven't learned any of those things yet. But as we go forward in this, we know that things like returning to a relationship with land is part of it. Respecting Indigenous sovereignty, there's no abolition without that. And we see in places like Emma's Acres out in BC that when people return in this very basic way into doing this work with your hands and changing the idea of labor from, you know, prison labor, which is taking place in the most exploitive conditions, you know, $28 every 2 weeks to like do every job in the prison that isn't security, right? Like the whole mess of prison labor that's completely exploited. The sweatshops, you have, you know, Corcan having people sewing blankets, like Indigenous women sewing blankets when their ancestors were like killed by smallpox blankets. You know, we have Black people laboring to make cabinets for the military. Somebody who's worked in Corcan gave me a list about 2 weeks ago when we were doing our No Life Left Behind show. He gave us a list of some things they make. And prison laborers, of course, used to make like the vans that take people away to prison. So like they are making the panels on the vans that take people. They're making parts of the cages that hold them. So they're actually making parts of the prison. They're making all kinds of stuff for the military on contract. So there's a huge connection between the military industrial complex and the prison industrial complex. They're making stuff for other prisons to imprison each other and themselves. And then like that's the kind of labor that's taking place. And so if that labor can be changed to even in some way being outside, being with community, as we see in the model for Emma's Acres, and I see an X and that Sean wants to speak. So Sean, I'll wrap this up because I know you're going to have a lot to say on this from experience. That changing even that idea of what kind of labor a person can do and how exploited that is, if we can get people into a different relationship with that, that starts to chip away at some of these bars and some of these bricks. So Sean, I'm going to pause and let you speak because I know that you have a lot of experience with this. So go ahead. Come off mute. Go ahead, Sean.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. All I wanted to say was, you know, when you're talking about guys building stuff in Corcan, not only do they build stuff for the military and prison, but they build stuff for private companies as well. And they pay these guys absolutely nothing. And the prison farm used to pay guys incentive pay to work, and they're taking that away from them as well. So there's going to be no incentive for these guys to work on these farms. It's getting crazier and crazier every day, you know. And you're saying, you know, just open up the doors and we wouldn't know what to do. Of course, they still don't know what to do when they let guys out. Guys get out now and they get out with nothing. And they have no support out there right now. There's no support for anybody when they get out on the street. And this program that they had, this prior program that I got out on, when you got out, at least you got out with a head on your shoulders, because you were cured. You had help when you were inside. Working with these animals saved my life. And we're not going to get the same thing with the goats. And that's all I wanted to say. So thank you for speaking. I really appreciate it. You seem to know a lot more about prisons than most people I talk to. So thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Sean. Anything I know was taught to me by guys in prison, and women in prison as well. So, and the teaching that you do is so important in this work. So I don't know if people have questions or you want to talk. Sean, hopefully you will be able to talk as well. Someone who worked on farms, that's obviously the first-hand experience. So I hope you're okay to answer questions as well.
Of course I am. I'm always good for that.
And I just want to add as well that Sean and people like Sean is one of the main reasons that I'm in this fight, and that so many other people have been in this fight, because, it wasn't a perfect program before, but it was a rare opportunity that inmates cherished. There was a long waiting list to be in a program that was better than nothing, and better than a lot of these other really exploitative programs that the correctional service has going on. So there was relevance. They were feeding themselves and they were interacting with animals in a one-on-one way. And then, of course, there were other aspects like having to send those animals to slaughter at the end of that process, or the trauma of difficulties in calving and calves dying and mothers dying. And just there were other aspects to it. And that's why our campaign has tabled the concept of an animal-assisted therapy model, which is fundamentally sanctuary. So if there are going to be animals, because we knew CSC was determined that it was going to be bringing animals onto the prison farm. So that's why we suggested taking an evidence-based approach to this, and one that would provide all of these meaningful opportunities from the past, but without that conflicted relationship. And in fact, that carceral mentality towards animals and labor and land. And sanctuary, the word itself being, but healing, a healing place. And we felt that this is something that fundamentally undermines carceral mentality. And as one prisoner wrote, it exemplifies the crossroads between incarceration and freedom. And I love, I'll open this up to other people in a moment, but I love that you make such pointed comparisons between human and animal slavery. And in fact, this reminded me of the book, The Dreaded Comparison by Marjorie Spiegel, who ties that comparison directly, and it's quite compelling. And also an excellent academic article by Kelly Struthers Montford, Land, Agriculture, and the Territorializing Function of Prison Farms. And she emphasizes that it's crucial that the new prison farms not reproduce the colonial relations to land, labor, and animals, and instead introduce models such as Evolve Our Prison Farms has proposed that would lessen rather than augment the trauma of incarceration. So those are my initial thoughts. And I also wanted to share the words from a woman who has inspired me a great deal, Abiodun Henderson, who is in Atlanta, Georgia, who runs Gangsters to Growers and the Come Up Project, which provides opportunities for formerly incarcerated Black youth to work growing food and producing a special hot sauce, Sweet Soul hot sauce. And she has spoken saying that I know for sure, she's Black herself, I know for sure my people have been traumatized working the land. First thought that comes to a lot of our minds is that slave work and I'm not doing it. But for me, having my hand in that rich soil every day was glorious. Being able to walk around and eat things right from the earth every morning, I loved it. It brought me back to my culture, loving myself, loving my people, and knowing that I could do something to contribute to the liberation of African American people. And I believe that an ethical and evolved approach to Canada's new prison farms could contribute to the liberation of our incarcerated brothers and sisters. But unless that happens, we will do everything it takes to stop it. So that's my perspective, and we will open it up to questions and comments from others.
Can I just make one more comment before you open up to everybody? Al, you were talking to me about the inmates building stuff for Corcan. Were you aware that the inmates helped build part of the prison up in Gravenhurst? They helped build part of the new
Yeah,
medium security prison. So
yeah, they were telling me that.
talking about guys making, guys having to do building stuff in prison. They made their own prison up in Gravenhurst, just for to throw that out
Yeah.
as well.
So I just learned that, and then somebody else was telling me about how like the third place in the world in Canada to have surveillance cameras is Sherbrooke, and it had to do with the highly incarcerated population as well. But yeah, Sean, thank you. Yeah, somebody just told me that 2 weeks ago that the guys in the Max were like building parts of like the Max that they were living in,
Yeah,
and building their own plans.
They built their own prison. So just I thought I'd throw that out there. So
Yeah.
I'll let everybody else talk now. I'm done.
Thanks,
Thank
Sean.
you.
I
We have this
see.
question. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Oh,
I was going to read this question in the chat, which was, is it legal in Canada to have goods made by incarcerated people sold in the private market, not just for the state? They have to be labeled. So this is like Jimmy Buffett's corporation keeps violating this. Corcan, so for those who don't know, Corcan is like Corrections Canada. It's like their like industrial wing workshops. They would love for them to be more productive. It's just that they're not. They can't get the quality up the way that is like required. If they could, they would be making stuff for like IKEA 24/7. It's just they can't, so it's mostly government contracts. So it isn't coming up on the scale like they wish it would. But no, they could sell it. It's just right now they don't have the kind of capacities to do it. They have all kinds of papers on this site about like their dreams to be making stuff for the private sector. One of the things they did make, they're selling indigenous crafts. APTN had an expose on this where they were like having guys making like moccasins and stuff, and obviously not in the style of their own nation, like nations that don't even have like dream catchers and moccasins, like making these things in this like pan-Indian style, which were then being sold as authentic indigenous crafts. And of course there's quite a lot of laws around what can be sold as an indigenous craft work, right? But yeah, Corcan was sort of like caught doing that a couple of years ago, or like CSC, I guess, not really Corcan. So, they've had like various things, but yeah, no, it would be legal. It's just, it's not, they haven't been able to sort of get to the point. So mostly it's government contracts, like desks for government, like cabinets for the Navy, stuff like that. Go ahead.
Yeah, exactly. So there are very small instances here and there of some goods that are sold to the private sector, but on a very small scale. They haven't quite figured out the way to go for an economy of scale in that regard. Almost all prison-produced goods in Canada are used internally by government departments, including Canada Post and the military and corrections. And there are a few examples, like technically people can apply to buy a filing cabinet that's been made in a prison or buy a desk. I've tried and I have not been successful. Trying to navigate that system to actually buy something that is produced by Corcan is prohibited to anybody who doesn't know the ins and outs of it. This new prison farm model is going to be exclusively for the private sector. So they are attempting to change prison labor in Canada. And according to the Queen's Business Law Clinic, under the human rights, the International Labor Organization of the United Nations, associating underpaid prison labor with the private sector is only permitted if it meets conditions of voluntariness, which is freedom from coercion or fear of penalty, which is not a condition that's met in Canada if you talk to any inmate, and wages and working conditions comparable to free workers. And again, that is not a condition that is met in Canada. They will only be paid under $1 an hour, and they are not classified as employees and technically have no worker rights. So this is going to be a violation of human rights, and we just need to figure out how to draw attention to that in time to change this.
By the way, there's been a lot of cases where people have tried to unionize prisoners, but they've always got around it. Sorry, Julia, go ahead.
I just have a comment and then a question. I just wanted to say that, like, I'm personally struggling to have faith that the government will do what's best in the interest of inmates and communities. And my belief is that most people who are in the system are, in fact, victims of trauma who have then perpetuated what has been taught to them with the little options and support for better choices and opportunities. Well, I think what we saw with the claim of fulfilled campaign promises of saving our prison farms was an outright bait and switch and a complete breach of public trust. And I would be interested in hearing Elle and others' perspectives on how do you maintain faith in achieving true justice?
Well, I don't have any faith in the system. I mean, it's not just prison. I mean, Trudeau could have changed the parole eligibility periods. That was something that was supposed to be changed. He didn't do it. So under Harper, we saw people even extending to 5 years in between, down from 2. I mean, up from 2. The 2-for-1 that was changed under Harper could have been changed back easily. Under Trudeau, it didn't happen. I mean, there's almost nothing under Trudeau. And even I remember how many of the institutions were opening up volunteering when Trudeau came in, because they thought like Trudeau was going to make all these changes. And when the Harper era is over, this is staff that were like, yay, maybe we can like do this and do that. And then it became clear under Trudeau that like nothing was changing. So all of those promises essentially being broken. But of course, who's going to hold Trudeau to account on that? But let's also talk about how the current Minister of Public Safety is Bill Blair, who was, of course, police chief in Toronto when everybody's rights were violated. They just had to settle for, $300+ million during the G20, including officers that covered their badges and received 1 day away from work for violating those rules. And of course, Bill Blair racially profiled as Toronto police chief and like defended racial profiling. And what happened? He got a promotion to Minister of Public Safety, where he has refused to let people out of federal prison during COVID and is responsible for multiple deaths, infections. Well, not multiple deaths, like 2 deaths, but I mean, that's multiple. But, we at various points, Joliet was like 60 to 80% infected, and basically gambled on not only the lives of people in prison, but the lives of people in the towns around those prisons, the lives of the staff, rather than simply do releases. So I don't have any faith in any government coming in to do justice, because I don't think a government is there to do justice. My faith is in us to do justice, which takes place through our ability to constantly out-organize and constantly pressure. And this is why prison reform doesn't work. And we can think of the history of Fry, right? Like Elizabeth Fry Society that used to be reformist. And then it was precisely after the Making Choices report, when, everybody sat down and did all this work with the government, and the fences went back up. They changed the idea of making choices, meaning give women choices and agency to, you should take responsibility for your crimes. I totally flipped that. And after that, Elizabeth Fry realized there was no point in like engaging with the system, and they became an abolitionist organization, right? So we know that in institutions, the cycle of like how an institution sustains itself, reform is part of that cycle, right? Crisis, like the police are going through this right now. There's a crisis. And then the way you keep going, you make some small changes and some reforms. And this is exactly why we are abolitionists, because we realize that we cannot just tinker around the edges of these systems. It doesn't work. So no, I don't expect, Trudeau's government to come in any of these promises, just like he failed all his promises to Indigenous people, just like, he was supposed to be reconciling and did not, just like, XYZ, all the things that will not happen. And they won't happen because we have to understand why there are prisons in the first place. They're prisons because they are colonial institutions that are here to do violence upon the bodies of Black people and Indigenous people, like the police do, like the borders do, like CBSA does, like so many systems in our society. Indigenous people in particular, are like on lands that are a threat to resources, and the ongoing so-called well-being of Canada's corporations is through the ability to build pipelines and continue to extract these resources. And Indigenous sovereignty is the single biggest obstacle to that. So Indigenous people will always be removed, and genocide will always be committed upon Indigenous people, because how Canada thinks of Canada and how Canada thinks of wealth and profit is not changing, right? And the prison is part of that. We don't believe there's a crime wave of Indigenous women in Canada, but 42% of our federal prisons, incarcerated women are Indigenous women, right? Like, obviously something else is happening here. So, there's no will. And like when we were talking about the private sector, if they could tomorrow put every Black person in prison and have us making like furniture for IKEA, we'd be doing it. It's just they haven't figured out how to do it yet. Like if they could do that, they would. You know, they'd be like, two of us would be in the government, one of us would be the Minister of Justice, and then everybody else would be in the prison making like cabinets, right? And they'd be like, but we have a Black Minister of Justice because those are the times we live in, right? I mean, it would be like a Black person walking us into the prison, and they'd be calling that EDI and diversity, right? So we're not going to, that's like a dark, cynical moment. I've made jokes before about Black Lives Matter on prison uniforms, you know, like we're going to have Black Lives Matter branded prison uniforms one of these days. I say that sarcastically, but actually that is a serious answer, because even in this time where we have this mass global protest, we're already seeing things like the Black North Initiative, which is like banks and corporations that are now claiming Black Lives Matter. And of course, they're not talking about divesting from prisons and policing. They're not talking about not, you know, running pipelines and not investing in the oil industry. They're talking about, let's make our boardrooms like 3% Black. Like, okay, so now Black people can sign off on the pipeline. Great, like that's justice. And that is the time we're living in, where these very serious movements that are really about rethinking power and rethinking our relationships to punishment and rethinking all of these relationships to capitalism are being appropriated even as we're in the streets. And, you know, businesses and, you know, kneeling cops and whoever are saying, well, this is what Black Lives Matter is. It's the same thing with, you know, these motions towards justice reform, right? That they don't want to change the system. They want to exactly tell us we're doing a farm and then make some profit selling goat milk to like baby formula factories in China, right? We But what I do believe is that we actually do have the power as people to organize. You know, we beat deportations by organizing 24/7. We've won wrongful convictions that, you know, nobody cared about by organizing. You know, we do have that power. And in doing that work, we have the power to, you know, bridge these relationships as well, to like get out there, talk to people in prisons, hear about the conditions, then get out and publicize that. And, you know, person by person, be doing that work to convince people that there's something else. And when we're all convinced and when a mass of us are convinced, that's when we're going to see a change, not from like top up, but from bottom. Go ahead, Calvin.
Yeah, you know, there's so many things that you say there that resonate with me. There are so many other stories of CSC attempting things that have failed for one reason or another, whether it's through public opinion and opposition, or even if it hurts industry. So, for example, you know, Sean talks about a time when corrections tried putting in a call center and having inmates doing call center work, and the companies complained, citing privacy concerns and the issue of how it will impact their industry to be outsourcing this work to prisoners. And they, of course, there were a number of problems that resulted from, you know, putting prisoners on the phone with people throughout the US. And anyway, so that got shut down. And we're saying here, we got a pipeline of infant formula coming out of a prison. And like we say, prison sourced baby formula leaves a sour taste. And how is that going to impact, you know, say the company's reputation that actually came to Canada to project, to restore consumer trust after the tainted milk scandals in China. So we can put pressure on the companies. We can increase public awareness and public voices and grow this from the ground up and appeal to some sympathetic politicians like Senator Kim Pate, who I hope might join us for a session one of these days. And you know that in many ways, as I run this campaign, a lot of the time I feel powerless, because who do you hold accountable? Who do you tattle to that this is happening? The public safety minister doesn't seem to care. The prime minister doesn't seem to care. The commissioner of corrections doesn't seem to care. And the CEO of Corcan is doing this. So who do we hold accountable? Solitary confinement in Canada was supposed to be ended in 2018, and the panel that was appointed to oversee the process is now speaking out, expressing immense frustration with the correctional service, because they basically, their hands are tied and they are powerless to make any changes here. And they are frustrated and saying, we're not going to continue this until things change, because we can't work with CSC. They render us powerless, and we still have not solved this problem. And now with the pandemic and the risk that this poses to inmates, and the fact that that is actually resulting, first of all, we're not depopulating prisons to protect our incarcerated people, and they've canceled the work programs. So escorted temporary absences, unescorted temporary absences, where prisoners were able to go out and do the kind of work that is a prerequisite to their progress to parole. That carrot that they dangle, that element that takes away voluntariness from the programs. You've just got to jump through the hoops that they tell you to jump through to get out. And now with the pandemic, they can't do the work programs. And so the parole boards are saying, we can't let you out. So we're actually seeing, rather than depopulating prisons, people are getting stuck in there even longer. So what's going on, and who do we hold accountable for all of these problems? So one of the reasons that we're holding on so tightly to this prison farm is that if we can create that swell of support and opposition to what's happening, and that vision of an alternative model that fundamentally undermines all of that carceral mentality, all of that pursuit of capitalism and profit, and actually cares about providing healing experiences and something good as people, which is needed. And this is about listening to the people inside who are desperate for something. And people like Sean, who talk about just how much it healed them, and how much that was needed in their lives. That's what we're fighting for. And we believe that this can plant a small seed of change that might just sprout and help to transform the rest. But like you say, Elle, reform is not a solution. This needs to be a deconstruction and construction of something organic. We have a question from Sean.
Just a comment, that's all. You're talking about the Corcan and everything like that. And you know, until we change the public's perception on prisoners, we're not going to be able to make any changes at all. The public, as long as the public perceives prisoners as being all bad and lock them all up and throw away the key, we're not going to be able to make any changes. And that's one of the big things that we've got to change, is the public perception of prisoners. Because whether we like it or not, guys are going to get out someday, you know. And as long as we look at the prisoners as being all bad and there's nothing we can do to help them when we get out here, then what's the point? What's the point? We got to realize that these guys are all going to get out, and we got to do whatever we can to make that transition one where they're going to be successful when they get out. And until we can do that, then we're not going to get Harper to be able to change his mind, or Trudeau to be able to change his mind, because all they're going to do is they're just going to go with whatever the public sees, and the public sees us as all being bad. And until we can that change, then, you know, it's just going to be a constant fight. And that's where I'm standing.
That's right. Thank you, Sean. That's exactly right. And I believe we're heading in that direction. The lock them up and throw away the key mentality is fading. And our government and corrections are behind the times and haven't recognized that public opinion, that society cares. We care about all members of society. We just need our institutions and the powers that be to follow and catch up with the rest of us. Darren, did you have a comment or a question?
Yeah, thanks, Sean, for your comment and about, you know, the need to change public perception about prisoners, which kind of leads into my question too. And Calvin, exactly what you said. I think to some degree, you know, public attitudes about prisoners and prisons are changing, but at the same time, even on our own Facebook comments, we see like there's still a lot of stigma and backlashes and people saying, you know, prisoners deserve to be exploited. That kind of sentiment just comes out a lot. So I guess I'm interested in hearing from Al, from Sean, from Calvin, just kind of general strategies, just a discussion about the kind of strategies for getting people to actually care more and understand more about issues related to prisons, because ultimately it still feels like something that is so hidden and so removed and so distant from, you know, most people's daily lives, unless you're in a community that is directly impacted by prisons and policing and criminalization, or you're in a community where prison is actually a significant industry. So that part I'm interested in hearing more about, strategies for organizing on the outside. And then the other part is I'm also interested in hearing more about, so earlier, Al, you mentioned, yeah, like for prisoners to unionize is just like almost impossible and super difficult. And yet we know that, you know, people do, like organize on the inside, and there have been strikes, hunger strikes, organizing of all sorts, riots historically. So often it comes at a great cost to the prisoners who participate in those actions. So yeah, I guess I'm interested in hearing more about then the kind of support like between the inside and the outside of prisons, and how do we do better organizing?
Sean, did you want to say something first? I saw you put an X in.
Yeah, well, it's the problem is organize. You're never going to be able to organize guys inside today, anyways, because the whole attitude of guys in prison now has changed. It's not like they're all young kids now, and there's no solidarity inside of prison anymore. So to get a unionized in prison is going to be almost impossible. But to change the public perception of people outside is everybody thinks outside is that everybody is bad and we're all dangerous. All they hear in the news is about the bad things, about guys getting out on parole and killing 4 or 5 people or raping 3 or 4 people. And that's what they go on. They base it on that one person that's come out and done something wrong. They don't hear about the success stories that come out. And until we can get that across to people that there are success stories that come out of prison, we're going to have a hard time changing public perspective. Until we can do that, it's going to be a battle. That's just, it's just the way it is.
I feel that there's so many parallels to this. We have trouble accepting what we don't understand, and we can't understand what we can't see or know. And prisons are closed. There are walls. And so we don't see the realities. We don't see the human beings behind those walls. And I'll tell you, if you go behind those walls and talk to those human beings or meet them, like people like Sean, who has become such a great friend, genuinely to me. I have met so many people and walked into their lives and seen through their eyes. And I see people who are no different from myself everywhere I look. And this is something that doesn't just apply to people in prison. I'm a trans guy, right? And a lot of people might be transphobic because they might have an image of what a trans person is, and maybe like Rocky Horror Picture Show or something like that. And they apply that image onto this idea of transness. But then they get to know someone like me, realize that, I'm just a human being like them. And then suddenly you don't have to make an argument about the rights of trans people or the rights of prisoners. You get to know them and you share in their experiences, and you recognize that despite our differences, we are no different from one another. And we begin to have compassion and we begin to care. So I really believe that sharing stories and people being visible, a lot of people who come out of prisons, for example, might not want to be known as having been formerly incarcerated. Just like a trans person might want to transition and then move on with their life and not know about their past or their history, and that's okay too. But at the same time, the more visible we are and the more we share our stories, the more understanding there can be and the more connectedness and community as a result of that.
And that's public perception, though. That's public perception on the prisoners. I didn't want to be known as a prisoner when I first came out. I did not, like, it was just, everybody looked at me like, you come out of prison, and because I did so much time, I'd come out and I'd go into a restaurant and I'd be hoarding my food, and people look at you like you're different. And it was different because I was so, my head was so messed around being in prison still, because it was such a shock, because there's nothing for you when you're coming out. And that's the first thing you experience, is you get this culture shock. And until we can get guys over that culture shock, public perception is going to be like, look at this guy, and so of course you don't want to be known as an ex-con,
And that's another reason why for the prison farms, for example, guys who are going to work in a factory farm with thousands of goats and work in the slaughterhouse at Joyceville Institution, coming out, are going to be not softer, not healthier.
They're going to be no better than they were before they started working there.
Exactly. But if there were a animal-assisted therapy program or a feel-good story or prison farms that do something good in the community, there is that community appreciation, love, and sharing in this positive vision of what this program can do, and then coming out into the community saying, I worked in that sanctuary, or I worked in this program helping to address hunger in this community. That is transformative.
the other,
Prison Carmen Kingston used to go to Kingston Fair every year and show cows, and people appreciated that, and we don't have that anymore. And that's the last thing I'm going to say. I'm sorry. I'll mute myself now.
no, don't mute yourself. Keep talking. I was just gonna say the other implication of this, and this is always CSC as well, like they do this with education programs. It's like they don't like things that they don't think translate into a menial job on the outside, right? So we've also seen the struggle for people to get university courses. You know, you can get your GED, but when you want to take university, they're like, why should we teach you that? Like, why should we teach you philosophy? You know, and so what we also see with the way the prison farm is being set up is, I think what's also implied there is, yeah, maybe you can go work in a slaughterhouse, like when you're done to minimum wage, you know. We don't want you to get these other kind of skills that you could use though, you know, like if you're actually training an animal or doing something, you know, that would be beyond labor. And like the whole history of the prison, if you go back to the Auburn system, Angela Davis and others talk about this, when you look at the history of the prison, the original idea of the prison is prayer and silent contemplation and labor, and the idea that work is going to like reshape your soul. It's a very Christian religious idea. And so it's still like this idea that we don't want to let people out to maybe like be in the sun, because that may be pleasurable, you know, but if they're just like, you know, slaughtering animals in a factory farm, I guess that's labor, right? So we're still seeing these old ideas. I think the thing we want to be careful of as abolitionists when we talk about strategies to talk to the public is that we have to be really careful, I think, in creating these divisions. This happened during COVID, right? Where we're like, well, we want to let like the non-violent people out. In Nova Scotia, we let out 41% of the provincial prisoners. It was actually like the leading province on that. Now they're putting them all back in, so don't get too excited. Then they like got rid of the housing subsidy and they're like, oh, everybody go back to jail now. But we had a big push. Sheila Wildman in particular with East Coast Prison Justice was really, really leading on doing that. Justice Pamela Williams agreed, and there's a big push. I forgot where I was going with this. I had a reason to talk about this.
Organizing strategies and divisive sort of discourse.
Oh yeah, no, I was gonna say non-violent people. I totally had a brain thing. But of course what happened is like then guys in the federal prisons were like, what about us? And guys that were doing life that had already done like 30 years were like, well, we're obviously not getting out because, you know, we're on these like murder life sentences. So it created even, you know, people then saw themselves as marked for death, right? Like people that are like, well, I'm not going to get a chance at this. I can see people walking out this door like every day. There's people walking out the door and I can't walk out that door because of, you know, I'm labeled violent or I'm labeled these things. So I think we have to be careful as well. Like our impulse is to talk about like, you know, pregnant women or like, you know, this woman just stole baby formula from Walmart, or, you know, this person, you know, they didn't commit a violent crime. And those are important things because of course people have a really distorted idea of the prison system from watching TV. You watch like Criminal Minds and it's like everyone's a serial killer and you know, and yes, of course, the vast majority of people in prison are there for non-violent crimes. The vast majority are there because of mental illness, addictions, trauma, like everybody's there for trauma. But the problem with that is it does then, from an abolitionist point of view, then like, where's the line? So we actually do as abolitionists have to talk about people on life sentences. And yes, we have to grapple with things like dangerous sex offenders and what that means. I don't think there's anyone, by the way, that's advocating Paul Bernardo should be roaming these streets. I think everybody's like Paul Bernardo needs to be somewhere that's away from people. But does that have to look like a prison as we understand a prison now? Like, what would that look like where Paul Bernardo is away and cannot harm people? But like, does that need to be with a cot with the toilet right there? Or is that some other way of keeping someone like Paul Bernardo secure? So nobody that's an abolitionist thinks that Robert Pickton or Paul Bernardo or any of these people should be out in community. We're not arguing that. But that's such a small percentage that people want to protect.
They're still human beings, and they got to be treated as such.
But like, why do we need to imagine a certain kind of treatment? So when they're like, here's Paul Bernardo's cell, and it's like, what does that do for you? Like, why is it that you want to see the toilet next to the cot, and then that makes you feel that punishment is being done in a particular way? Like, being away from society is the punishment. And of course, most people are not serial killers, but we need to talk about what that means. We can't avoid that question. We can't pretend that abolition is only for the innocent. Abolition is only for, you know, women, but not men. Abolition is only for non-violent people and not people who have committed violent crimes. And again, that doesn't mean that we're avoiding these questions. And that's why I'm like, we're not ready yet because we don't know how to actually look at someone who's committed a violent crime and talk that through and work that through. And what does accountability look like? And what does that harm look? We haven't, the faintest of us how to do that, but it can be done. It's not that it can't be done. It can be done, and we need to work towards that. But public strategies, it's difficult. When we were doing Abdi, that deportation, we went to a lot of that rhetoric. He's been in Canada his whole life. He's been here since he was 6, and it was like very effective. But it was relying on stuff like the innocence of a child. Like we were using pictures of him as a 6-year-old for a reason. But that shouldn't matter. If you've been in Canada one day, you should still have the same rights, and you shouldn't be subject to deportation, right? You don't have to be an innocent child to have sympathy. So it's just a dangerous game that we often play when we sort of get into this, like which prisoner is the right prisoner, which is the test case. We often find ourselves doing that, legally, or like, what's the best test case, for this thing. But I think as abolitionists, we also have to push ourselves to deal with the really uncomfortable areas. Yes, the dangerous sex offenders, what are we going to do about that? What does that mean for us, and what responsibility does that put on us? And what does it mean when we advocate against prisons? What is our solution? Like, we have to be able to take those things on in a serious way. And I don't think that's a gotcha question. That's also a question. So you believe in murderers and rapists? You're like, you're not actually, like, you think you're trying to trip me up here, but you're not tripping me up, because I think seriously about that. And I actually work with dangerous sex offenders too. So it's not like something that's this mythical thing. Like, as Sean said, like, they're also human beings, and human beings have caused great harm, and human beings have caused great damage, but they're still human beings. Like, it's not an alien being over here, So yeah. And then as far as prison organizing goes, I'm trying to do all the questions all at once. As part of the prison strike in 2018, we helped to organize the Burnside prison strike, which was one of in this sort of current wave. There's been a lot of strikes during COVID. Laval, people in immigration detention struck. Maplehurst had a strike. There was a wave. In fact, for Prisoner Justice Day, they had like notices up all over the Ontario prisons, like warning people, like, you better not strike, because they were all shook from all the other strikes. But before that wave, which happened during COVID in 2018, when there was a prison strike in the States, one institution joined that, and that was Burnside. So we had the opportunity to work with the prisoners through BPH, our radio show, and through other platforms to really work on that strike. And it was actually, there's a lot of it. Well, what was funny, first of all, is like, you're never working with the whole institution. Like, you're talking to a couple, 3 or 4 guys. So they were like, we want to strike. And then everyone else found out they were striking. They're like, we're striking, yeah. But one of the things they agreed to was, like, nobody took a disciplinary for 3 weeks. And so they got through 3 weeks with no levels, which required, people really, like, having self-discipline and having like real collective action. They just, like, as an institution, as this news sort of spread that yes, they were striking, and yes, they were doing this thing, people were calling with all kinds of information. Like, a lot of people put in and took a lot of risk on that. And yeah, I mean, was it successful in the sense of, did they get what they asked for? No. And the same thing happened in Maplehurst recently, where they said to stop the strike, they promised them that they would get everything they were asking for, which is always minor stuff. When people are striking, they're asking for like nutritious food. They're asking for clothing, mattresses, like winter clothing, mattresses, shoes are the same size that fit, access to the showers, it's just stuff like that. Sorry, I'm about to sneeze. Like things that are part of your basic human rights package in the first place. And then, they're like, yeah, you can have that. And they don't give it to them. So in that sense, it didn't work. In the sense of people were punished, it didn't work. A lot of people were transferred away. Some people were given federal transfers, given federal remands and sent off to federal. But in the sense of the possibilities that exist when people understand that they can organize, I think those are still really important. Seeing prisoners be able to organize, because it requires this kind of collective work. One of my best friends is one of, I won't say which institution, but he's the head of inmate committee at like one of the institutions. And like, every time he talks to me, his leadership skills, I'm like, people wish that this guy was, negotiating for things out in the public for a corporation. He's like, oh yeah, there were bullets flying in the yard. And then I like heard my name and I had to walk over and like, negotiate with the guards to get the guys back inside, like he's doing that stuff all the time, these tremendous skills of organizing. Like he's always having problems with the guys in the kitchen taking the food, and then they want to like fire people from the kitchen. So like, get people back like to the kitchen. So people have, but what I'm saying is he has those capacities, and so many people in prisons. And Sean, what you're saying about generational thing is very funny, because he's only like 27, but he's always making the same complaint, like these young guys, they don't respect the thing anymore, but that's exactly it. That there are actual cultures of organization. There were and are, which jails have done, prisons have done a lot to try and break up the older guys that had those skills, transfer them out all the time, make sure they're not able to like, like teach ranges in the same way. We used to have the older guys that would sort of put people in line, and then everybody knew how to behave, and it kept they were doing that work. And prisons have seen that now as being criminogenic or something, and they're like, let's get rid of these guys that have leadership skills. And that's why you're seeing more violence and chaos often, because you don't have those older guys, those lifers that are there, that are able to do that organizing work, which they're very experienced at. And then when those guys are getting out, we're not actually tapping into that. Like, people that have been and survived in prison 10, 15, 20 years have amazing skills that any, like, and I'm not a capitalist, but if I were a CEO, I'd want that guy working in my corporation, because he knows how to negotiate. He knows how to deal with power. He knows how to get things. So people who used to work with nothing, like, people have these amazing, amazing skills that they're organizing every day. And like, we on the outside need to tap into that and really work with those people. Really, really understand that their skills are here to organize us. Like, when I talk to him, I'm like, let me take notes, because when I'm out in the streets trying to organize, like, I need to know what you're doing so I can organize in my community. So again, prisoners, like, they have those capacities in very real ways. Sean's really happy. Go ahead, Calvin. I see your hand up.
Okay, I mean, that's wonderful, Elle, and I want to be respectful of time, but it goes back to that idea of people projecting an image on a whole population of people, which is no different than racism. It's no different than sexism. There's no difference between incarcerated human beings and non-incarcerated human beings. They are as intelligent, they are as compassionate, they suffer mental illness as well, or addictions, just like people on the outside do, who maybe just didn't caught up in the system as a result of it. They are every type of person that you find on the outside, you'll find on the inside as well. The only difference between us being the walls and perhaps life experiences. So, and I think there's just two quick questions I want to address very, very quickly. Somebody had messaged, what is the timeline for the proposed goat slaughterhouse?
The goat prison.
Yeah, the goat prison. As Sean described them, they're just going to be four-legged prisoners instead of two-legged prisoners. The slaughterhouse is already there. It's been there since the 1980s. When they closed the prison farms, they protected the slaughterhouse because it was the main money maker. So now, instead of killing animals there using prison labor to feed prisoners, all of the work using prisoners in that slaughterhouse is for the private sector. That's one of the rare examples of prison labor being used exclusively for the private sector in Canada. So that was just kind of grandfathered in. It's already there. The goat factory that is going to be built at a price tag of millions of dollars. The timeline, according to the Correctional Service of Canada, the pandemic will have no impact on timelines. And they claim that the construction is going to begin this year, which is inconsistent with their other messaging that the request for proposals for the construction will be issued not before December 2020. So I don't know how they're going to manage to issue a request for proposals, evaluate the bids, do all the necessary security checks, hire the contractors, and begin construction before the end of this year. But they are gunning for it, and they have been claiming that the first 800 goat kids will be arriving this year. So far, they haven't managed to make that happen, so now they're saying next year. But either way, we are looking at within a matter of months for this whole thing to begin, unless we can influence it before then. And then there is a rather complex question. How do we push conversations on abolition beyond the defunding frame to reimagining care and our relationships to land, each other, and ourselves? How do or can we build people power and mass resistance to all forms of carceral violence in that way? That could be a whole topic for a whole other day. And I believe...
I mean, yeah, I think, as I said, like, defunding, it's not like it's widely taken up, but people are able to talk about it in ways, I think, because it's capitalist, right? Like, okay, so there's a budget, and then like you move money from the budget to another budget. Like, that still makes sense to people in a capitalist framework. Abolition requires, I think, a lot of thoughts about our own values, a lot of self-reflection, even within groups that, I was in a group this summer that was, an abolish group, but then, there was a lot of failures in abolition politics when it came to, people getting rid of punishment in our minds. Like, it's difficult, because people, it's one thing to say hashtag abolish, and it's another thing to actually deal with the complexities of what abolition looks like, our own desires for punishment that exist in us. When we get tested, then you're like, oh, fuck, I wish that person was in prison, our, our ability to be honest about where our failures are and where our lines are and where our boundaries are. Bell Hooks tells us that, when we live in a society built on domination, we will fail our values all the time, and I think we have to be honest about that as abolitionists. I think we also have to be honest when we talk to other people about those complexities. I'm not really interested in like hashtag activism myself. So I think it's really important to say, like, this isn't like, you don't just, if anybody says, oh, I became an abolitionist and I was like just 100% on board with like abolishing prison for serial killers, I think you're a liar, because you actually haven't. It is a journey, and everybody who does this work, it's over years where, you like think one thing and then you have to test that and challenge that and, work with this person differently and fail at it. And like, it's a very long journey. So when Mariam Keba tells us, if you haven't been an abolitionist, like long-term, it's not the time to take the mic. She's not gatekeeping. She's saying that, you're not going to wake up tomorrow and suddenly have a fully fledged, like truly thought out vision of what it's going to be like to live without prisons, because that's really, really complex, because we live in a society that punishes and incarcerates all over the place. As I said, like we can't even have goats without incarcerating them. And we think we're going to move away from like incarcerating people this quickly. So I think we have to be really honest about what this work means. I don't think we should be afraid of honesty. I don't think we should be afraid of saying it's really difficult sometimes. Yes, there's people that I sometimes, like, I'm an abolitionist, but sometimes I'm like, oh, I don't know. Like, I wish you were in prison, like, oh, I can't argue for that one, right? Like, that's actually human and real. And I think we actually need to talk about that and then have other people push us and talk about when we failed. Like, I believe in the environment, but I eat out of plastic, you know what I mean? So I think that we need to be willing to have those complex conversations, but also in a very human way, because abolition isn't about being, more radical than thou. I'm cooler than thou. I'm an abolitionist, so I'm cooler than you because you're a mere defunder. Like, that's not what we want to get into. We want to say, like, just as the environmental movement is doing, just as a lot of our movements, even like Bernie Sanders movement, that we're having these conversations where we're seeing that what we're doing is not working. COVID is showing us how much what we're doing is killing people, right? And COVID should have showed us once and for all that we're only as well and safe and protected as the least loved and least protected among us, So yes, when we have homeless people, if you didn't care about that person for themselves, you cared when it was COVID, and really you suddenly realize that if these people are living on the streets, they might, spread disease to the people that you think matter, right? And then we found hotels. And then we were like, yes, we can house people. We didn't care about prisoners, and lots of people don't, but when they realized guards and, the town might be infected, we found a way to care about letting people out. So we can do it. We can shift things, we can change things. And we also, through COVID, should have realized that, like, this society that's transferring wealth upwards, this society that's increasingly putting, people with disabilities, people with mental health challenges, people with addictions, just locking them away and throwing the key. It's not working, because that's where COVID, is growing. The people that we wanted on the front lines, the seniors we wanted to hide away in homes and not provide any proper care to, and we saw death. So I'm not a believer that we're just going to have this mass wake-up call, but for those of us who know this, we have the ability now to keep organizing. And so when you're talking about this prison farm, I know climate strike is coming up again, like, get the environmental movement on board. There's a lot of young people that are involved in things like defunding police and care about the environment, and they should care about something like a prison farm. You can bring them in and get them to see why this matters. There's a lot of people, even during COVID, like, plants are a thing, everyone's like, why does everyone suddenly have plants now? Like, a lot of people have got into things like food sovereignty and growing. You can reach out. Black people, decolonial growing and land movements is like really growing among Black people. When I was in Jamaica, there's all kinds of like refarming the yard and like source farm and stuff. So Black people are increasingly understanding that our politics is also tied to land. And as I said in that really great quote, for a few generations of society that was slave work, like my mother had to pick fruit and stuff, So we had an aversion to this kind of thing. And, we were told it was dirty and poor, and people got rid of their chickens and their pigs. And now everyone's like back to it, But Black people are understanding that, Black power, Black sovereignty, Black freedom is going to rest in land. And we're getting into farming and stuff too. So Indigenous people have always, of course, understood this as well. So there's a lot, it's a coalition movement. There's a lot of coalitions that can be made where people understand how these issues connect. And Calvin, I know you want to talk, so go ahead.
Well, I just want to wrap things up because our hour is up, but that's fine. This has been an excellent session, and I think that the theme that emerges from this is intersectional justice. There is no one justice movement that stands in isolation. Everything is connected. The environment, animals, human rights, and like the old saying, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And intersectional justice is something that people are coming to understand. And we can't solve all the problems, we can't solve problems on a global scale, but we can think locally, we can act locally, and we can tend to our little corner of this world and do what's in us to do to make it a little better than when we entered it. As you know, I'm just going to conclude with a few words. We have more questions coming in, but we don't have time to get to them today. But in my opinion, as a society, like Elle says, we need some way to respond to problems of crime in society. But the correctional system, as it stands, does not do that task. And in my opinion, it's broken beyond repair and must be abolished. So as each of us wrestles in our own unique way, from our own unique experience, in our own unique corner of advocacy, be it for prisoners or animals or earth or Black or Indigenous peoples or any hurting human being or any other hurting being or all of the above. As each of us wrestles with what it would look like to respond in healthy, healing ways to societal brokenness, we are all a part of a much larger movement to break down the concrete structures of oppression so that organic alternatives can begin to grow through the cracks. So thank you all so very much for your time. Thank you, Elle, for your beautiful words and insights.
Yes, thank you, Elle.
Julia, Darren, and Sean. And so I will close for my part from that. Elle, did you have anything you wanted to end with?
Yes, I wanted to thank, is it Jesse who did the artwork? That's really beautiful, the posters and everything.
Jamie.
So Jamie, I knew it was a J word, you told me. So I want to thank Jamie for that. And Sean, did you want to have the last word? Maybe take us out, maybe speaking a little bit about your experiences. I think that would be an appropriate way to end. But thank you everyone so much for having me, and thank you for all your work. And Sean, let's give us our last words.
Well, first of all, thank you all. Thank you all for coming tonight. I really appreciate it. And I did 23 years in prison, and my last 5 were spent at Frontenac with the cows. And I've always told people this: if it wasn't for that place, I wouldn't be where I am today. And if we, through all of this advocacy work, if we can change one guy, if I can make one guy come out there like I did, then I've been a success in my life. And that's all I want, is one guy to experience the healing aspect that I did, and I'm fine with that. That's all I want, is one person to change. And if we can do that, then we've all done a job. If we can just get one person to change, then we've made that first step, and that's all that really matters. Once we make that first step.
Thank you, Sean.
Thank you.
We start small and do what we can.
That's right. Thank you all for coming tonight. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, and I hope to see you all in Kingston at some point.
Yes, come and see us, please. Come and see us. Please come and see us.
I need to come through, but I don't know, like your guys' COVID is getting worse. So, every time I think I might be able to come, the problem is I'd have to quarantine on the way back, eh? But I want to come through. All right. Have a good night, everybody.
Have a good night, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great night.
Thanks, Julia.
Oh, thank you, Sean. Bye.
Bye.